The first time I caught her lurking near my backyard, I thought it was just nosy HOA nonsense. But when my tomato plants started curling into brown skeletons 2 days later, I knew something was up. I didn't know it yet, but that smug woman Wanda Shelton, the newly elected HOA president, was about to start a war she couldn't win. My name's Zeke Sanders. I'm a carpenter, divorced, no kids unless you count my Labrador, Hank. I moved into the Willow Creek subdivision about 3 years ago. Quiet place, decent neighbors, and a little garden patch out back that I took stupid pride in. I'd built the raised beds myself, grew everything from scratch: tomatoes, peppers, zucchini, and this year some heirloom carrots I'd swapped seeds for online. I'd never had a problem. Until Wanda got elected. Wanda Shelton was all the worst parts of a middle school principal, and a traffic cop rolled into one high-strung, lip-glossed package. She had a clipboard fused to her arm and always wore that thin-lipped expression like she smelled a fart. Everyone in the neighborhood just called her Karen in charge, and she took that title seriously. 2 weeks after she took over the HOA, I got my first warning letter. Your backyard garden fencing is not in compliance with HOA aesthetic standards. Remove or replace within 7 days. The fencing was a 2-foot decorative wooden border I'd stained myself, not an eyesore by any means, but Wanda had decided it clashed with the neighborhood's overall presentation. I ignored it. Legally, she didn't have grounds. Our bylaws didn't say a word about backyard fencing unless it was over 4 feet tall or chain link. Mine was neither. A week later, I came home from work to find a second letter duct taped to my front door. Final notice. Failure to comply will result in HOA fines of $50 per day. I laughed. Then I walked inside, grabbed a beer, and tossed the letter in the trash. That should have been the end of it. But Wanda wasn't the kind of woman who liked to be ignored. 3 days later, I caught her on my property. I'd gotten home early from a job site, rained out, and as I turned the corner around my house, there she was, standing by my garden with a jug in her hand. She didn't see me at first. She was wearing a wide-brimmed straw hat and some kind of pink gardening gloves. I watched her tilt the jug and pour a slosh of something across the base of my tomato bed. "Hey," I shouted. Wanda jerked back, dropped the jug, and spun around like a raccoon caught in a cooler. "Oh, Mr. Sanders. You startled me. What the hell are you doing in my yard?" I was just inspecting. There have been reports of invasive plants spreading into neighboring lots. I thought I saw something unusual. Pretty sure inspecting doesn't involve dumping mystery liquid on my vegetables. She blinked, like she couldn't believe I'd actually said something back. "I hardly think that's an appropriate tone, Mr. Sanders. As the HOA president, I have a responsibility to get out of my yard. Now." Wanda's entire face tightened. She picked up the jug quickly, like she didn't want me to get a good look, and stormed off down the side of my house without another word. I checked my plants. The soil smelled off. Chemical, like detergent and gasoline had a baby. I scooped a sample into a plastic bag and stuck it in the fridge just in case. That night, I installed a motion-activated camera on the back of my house, angled right at the garden. I also sent a copy of the HOA bylaws to my brother-in-law, who was a paralegal in Raleigh. Just to be safe, the next morning the tomato plants had started to wilt. Over the next week, the damage spread. My peppers browned and crumpled. The zucchini leaves got strange white splotches. Even the carrots never broke the surface. It was like the whole bed had been poisoned. I sent the soil sample to a local lab that did agricultural testing. It cost $90, but I needed proof. Meanwhile, Wanda doubled down. I got another letter claiming my dead garden violated landscaping standards and was bringing down neighborhood property values. She started citing me $50 a day. My mailbox looked like a slot machine of fines, but the camera, it worked. 2 nights later, I got an alert on my phone: motion detected. I pulled up the feed and there she was again, creeping across my yard in that stupid straw hat, holding the same red jug. She poured more of it into the garden, then tiptoed off like she hadn't just committed a crime. I saved the footage. Then I emailed it to myself, my brother-in-law, and a local news tip line. By the time the lab report came back, I was ready. The soil was contaminated with glyphosate concentrate, basically industrial-strength weed killer, not the kind you'd use for dandelions. The kind you'd use to clear entire fields before construction. Illegal for residential use in our state without a license. I printed everything out: footage stills, the lab report, the HOA letters, and made a neat little folder. Then I called a meeting with the HOA board. They didn't want to meet at first, but I insisted. If they refused, I'd bring it to the city council. The board was made up of 3 people. Wanda, of course, some retired dentist named Carl who barely spoke, and a woman named Janet who seemed halfway decent. We met at the community clubhouse on a drizzly Thursday evening. I brought coffee. Wanda didn't even look at me when I sat down. "I believe this meeting is a waste of time," she said, flipping through her folder. "Mr. Sanders is clearly in violation of multiple HOA codes." "Actually," I interrupted, pulling out my folder, "I think we should talk about chemical vandalism and trespassing." That got their attention. I slid the lab report across the table. Then I pulled up the camera footage on my tablet and hit play. Wanda's face drained like someone had pulled the plug in a bathtub. Carl leaned forward. "Is that—" "Yes," I said. "That's her on my property. 2 times. With a jug of illegal herbicide she dumped on my plants." Wanda opened her mouth, but no sound came out. "I've already filed a police report," I continued. "I've sent copies of everything to the authorities, to a local reporter, and to my attorney. I'm here tonight as a courtesy to give the board one chance to act before this goes fully public." Janet looked like she wanted to slide under the table. Carl stared at Wanda. You did this?" he asked. Wanda finally found her voice. "I was protecting the neighborhood." "His garden was an eyesore. It was spreading weeds." "No, it wasn't," Janet said quietly. "It was one of the nicest yards on the street." I looked Wanda dead in the eye. "You stepped onto my property and poisoned my plants. That's criminal trespass and property damage. If you don't resign, and if the board doesn't suspend all fines immediately, I'll make sure every homeowner in Willow Creek sees this footage. And I'll push for a full investigation into how you've been running this HOA." Silence. Wanda's nostrils flared. "You're bluffing." I pulled out a printed copy of the email I'd sent to the local news station. "Try me." Janet didn't say anything for a long moment. She just kept staring at the tablet screen, frozen on the frame where Wanda was mid-pour, her pink gloves blurry in motion. Carl rubbed his face with both hands and muttered something none of us could hear. Wanda sat there stiffly, her arms crossed so tight it looked like she was holding herself together with sheer effort. Finally, Janet leaned back and spoke, her voice low and deliberate. "I want the board to vote on an immediate suspension of all fines against Mr. Sanders, pending the outcome of the police investigation," she said, glancing at Carl. Carl nodded without hesitation. "Agreed." Wanda snapped her head toward him. "You're both overreacting." "He had unregistered plant species. You saw the weeds." "No one saw any weeds," Janet cut in. "And even if there were, that doesn't justify what you did. You know that." Wanda opened her mouth again, but this time I didn't give her the chance. "I'm filing a restraining order first thing tomorrow. And if you step foot on my property again, Wanda, you'll be violating it. I suggest you stay far away." She stood abruptly, knocking her chair back with a loud scrape. "This is a witch hunt. I've served this community for years. Your resignation is expected by the end of the week," Carl said, louder than I'd ever heard him speak. "We'll hold a special election next month." She stormed out, muttering something under her breath. The door slammed behind her. Janet let out a long breath and looked at me. "I'll walk the suspension paperwork over to your house tomorrow. If you need anything for your case, I'll cooperate." I nodded. "I'd appreciate that." Carl stood up slowly and followed her out, leaving me alone in the clubhouse's musty meeting room. I packed up my folder, tucked the tablet under my arm, and stepped out into the night. The next morning started with a knock on my door. It wasn't Janet, it was Officer Langston, the same patrolman I'd spoken to when I filed the initial report. He looked more serious than before, no clipboard this time, just a notepad and a camera slung over his shoulder. "We've got a warrant to inspect her shed," he said as I signed the statement he handed me. "Preliminary tests matched your soil sample to a restricted use formulation. Not something you can buy at a hardware store," He paused, adjusting his cap. We also got a tip she may have more of the stuff stored improperly. You weren't the only one she's had issues with. That caught my attention. You saying she's done this before? Can't say yet, he replied. But you're not the first complaint we've had about her going overboard, just the first with evidence. About an hour later, 3 cruisers and a city truck rolled up to Wanda's house. I didn't watch from my window like some gossiping neighbor. I walked my dog past casually and caught a glimpse of them hauling out a red container that looked identical to the one I saw in the footage. A man in a fireproof suit was taking photos. A detective in plain clothes was asking Wanda something on the porch. She refused to look at him, her arms crossed again, sunglasses hiding her face. By the end of the day, she was in handcuffs. I got a call from the assistant district attorney that evening. The charges were serious. Felony use of a restricted substance without a license, criminal trespass, destruction of private property, and endangering the environment. Apparently, the concentration was so high that runoff from a single rainstorm could have contaminated the nearby storm drain, which fed into a local stream. You did the right thing by documenting everything, the ADA told me. It's rare we get a case this clean. That night, I sat on my porch with Hank at my feet and watched as the neighborhood buzzed. Word had spread fast. Wanda's once pristine lawn was now cordoned off with yellow tape. Someone had turned her nameplate on the mailbox upside down. A few neighbors even gave me a nod as they passed, something they hadn't done much before. The next day, Janet showed up as promised. She brought a manila envelope with the suspension paperwork and an apology. I didn't know she was capable of something like this, she said, shifting uncomfortably. She always acted like she had everything under control. We assumed she was just particular. She crossed a line, I said, and I'm guessing I wasn't her only target. Janet hesitated. There's a guy on Maple Loop, James Patel. She fined him $500 for having a wind chime visible from the sidewalk. When he pushed back, his shed was broken into. Nothing was stolen, but his tools were all moved around. No proof it was her, but, well, now people are talking. Let them talk, I said. She got away with this kind of stuff because no one held her accountable. That ends now, Janet nodded. The board's meeting next week to revise the enforcement process. No more single-person inspections. Everything will be documented. And any fines over $50 will require a vote. I could tell she meant it. Maybe they'd finally learned. Later that week, I was interviewed by the local news. They ran the story under the headline, HOA President Arrested for Poisoning Garden. I didn't give them much beyond what they already knew, but the footage of Wanda creeping through my yard played on the evening segment. The public reaction was swift. Homeowners from neighboring subdivisions started sharing their own horror stories about overzealous HOA presidents. The segment went viral in the way local news rarely does. A week later, I got a hand-scribbled letter from a woman in a town 2 counties over. She said her HOA had tried to bulldoze her flower beds because they weren't uniform, and seeing my story gave her the courage to fight back. That meant more than anything else. The arraignment was held quietly, but I still went. Wanda didn't look at me once. Her lawyer tried to argue it was a misunderstanding, that she didn't know the substance was restricted. The judge wasn't buying it. Bail was set, but the conditions were strict. She couldn't return to the neighborhood, and she was barred from serving on any housing board pending the outcome of her case. The garden was a loss that season, but my brother-in-law helped me replace the soil. We dug the beds out completely, installed a gravel base and fresh compost. I planted again, late summer crops this time. Beans, squash, and some fast-growing lettuce. The sprouts were already poking through by the end of the month. The HOA held their special election in early October. Janet ran unopposed and won. Carl stepped down and was replaced by a young woman named Melissa who worked in urban planning. At the first meeting, they passed a motion to audit all existing fines issued in the last 12 months. Over half were reversed. They also voted to install a community mediation panel, 3 homeowners, elected annually, to settle disputes before they escalated into fines. Things changed. Nobody was eager to take Wanda's place as the neighborhood watchdog. The clipboard disappeared. the threats stopped. People started putting up porch lights again. A few even added little decorative fences around their flower beds. One guy on the corner put up a gnome army, and nobody said a word. As for me, I installed a second camera, this one facing the front yard. Not because I expected trouble, but because it never hurts to be ready. Hank still sniffed near the garden bed every morning, like he half expected Wanda to come sneaking back in. I'd give him a pat on the head and tell him, "She's gone, buddy," and she was. 3 weeks after Wanda Shelton was led from her house in handcuffs, the neighborhood felt like it had exhaled for the first time in years. People began talking to each other openly again, not just in passing but real conversations at mailboxes, over fences, on porches with coffee mugs in hand. It wasn't dramatic, not some big group hug moment, but something subtle had shifted. The air felt lighter. The clipboard patrols were gone. The atmosphere of paranoia she'd cultivated had collapsed under its own weight. I hadn't expected to be a neighborhood hero, but it happened anyway. Folks I barely knew started waving when I walked Hank. One guy, Darryl from 2 streets over, even brought over a 6-pack and said he'd been fined for having a yellow recycling bin Wanda claimed was too reflective. We drank 2 beers standing in my driveway while he told me how he'd always suspected she was unhinged, but figured it was easier to keep his head down. "Turns out," he said, tipping the bottle toward me, "all it takes is one guy with a camera and a backbone." I didn't have much to say to that, so I just nodded and offered him another, but beneath the surface, things weren't completely settled. The state's environmental agency had opened an investigation into Wanda's use of the glyphosate concentrate. Apparently, she'd bought it online through a company that didn't verify licensing. It wasn't just illegal to use, it was illegal to possess in the quantities they found in her shed. The stuff was banned for residential use in the entire state after a runoff incident 2 years ago killed a section of wetland. The county prosecutor contacted me again, this time to let me know there would be a grand jury hearing. They wanted to pursue additional charges: environmental endangerment and possession of a restricted substance with intent to distribute. I didn't understand at first how distribution factored in, until he explained they'd found labeled containers in her garage, each marked with addresses. Mine was one of them, so was James Patel's, and 4 others. They suspected she had been planning to neutralize what she considered problem yards. I hadn't expected it to go that far. I agreed to testify. The day I was called in, the courthouse was humming with activity. I sat in a small waiting room with James, who I'd only met once before. He was a soft-spoken guy, probably in his 50s, who worked nights at a packaging plant. He looked tired, but when he saw me, he gave a short nod. "She dumped something on my lawn, too," he said without preamble. "Didn't have proof, but my grass turned white overnight. I thought it was a fungus. You ever report it?" "No point. It was just me saying it happened. You had the camera." We sat in silence for a bit, the fluorescent lights buzzing above us. Eventually, an assistant DA came in and called me back. Testifying wasn't what I expected. I thought it would be more dramatic, but it was mostly questions about what I saw, what I recorded, what I'd done with the footage. The jury listened carefully, especially when I told them how Wanda had tried to justify her actions as protective measures. I handed over the lab report, the footage, the emails. The DA asked me if I'd ever had any disputes with Wanda prior to the incident. "No," I said. I didn't even know her last name until the first citation showed up. After I was done, I stepped outside and took a long breath. The air smelled like rain was coming. I didn't stick around to see who else testified. A week later, a detective called to tell me the grand jury had returned an indictment. Wanda was being formally charged with 6 felony counts, including environmental endangerment and criminal mischief. She was facing serious prison time. It was no longer just a local drama, it had become a state case. Meanwhile, the Willow Creek HOA underwent a complete restructuring. Janet called for a community-wide bylaws review. They hosted an open forum at the school gym, and for the first time, it was packed. People showed up with notebooks, questions, even legal printouts. A man in the back offered to help rewrite the landscaping clauses. I found out later he was a retired municipal attorney. Melissa, the new board member, organized subcommittees to oversee transparency and dispute resolution. It wasn't perfect, but it was real progress. One evening, about a month after the indictment, I got a knock at my door. It was a woman I didn't recognize, short, athletic build, buzzed hair. She introduced herself as Claire Thomas, a field agent with the state's Department of Environmental Quality. She carried a thin metal briefcase, and her ID badge was clipped to her jacket. "I'm following up on the Willow Creek chemical incident," she said. "We're doing secondary soil assessments in the affected properties. You're at the top of the list." I led her around back and showed her the rebuilt garden beds. She walked the perimeter, took samples with a small metal corer and sealed them into sterile bags. "It's unlikely there's any residual contamination," she said, "but we have to be thorough." The concentration she used was high enough that it could have leached deeper than surface level. She paused, glancing at the camera mounted under my eaves. "That footage you caught," she added, "might have saved your water table." I hadn't thought of that. She left after an hour, promising to send the results within 10 days. Before she left, she handed me a pamphlet explaining how to apply for a restitution credit through the state's Environmental Damage Fund. Apparently, the prosecutor had requested it be made available to all affected homeowners. The letter from her office came a few days later. My soil was clean, no residual toxins. The compost and gravel barrier had done the trick. Still, I applied for the restitution. They covered the cost of the soil replacement and even reimbursed me for the camera. It wasn't about the money, it was about making it official. They were acknowledging what she'd done. That same week, I got a call from a local university's agricultural science department. One of their grad students had seen the news coverage and was interested in studying the impact of urban chemical misuse. They asked if I'd be willing to let them document my garden recovery over the next season. I said yes. It felt good to turn something ugly into something useful. Spring came early that year. My new plants came in strong rows of bright lettuce, deep green beans, and the first blossoms on the squash vines. I added a trellis for climbing tomatoes and hung a bird feeder nearby. Hank took to laying beside the beds like a sentry, keeping a watchful eye on the garden like it was a sacred thing. One Saturday morning, I was spreading mulch when a group of kids wandered by on their bikes. One of them stopped and pointed. "Is that the garden that lady tried to kill?" I looked up, surprised. "You heard about that? My mom said you caught her like a ninja, with cameras and dirt science," I laughed. "Something like that." They rode off, laughing, but I stood there a moment longer, watching the way the sunlight hit the garden. The soil was dark and rich, the plants healthy, the air full of birdsong. It felt like something had been restored. Not just the garden, but the entire rhythm of the neighborhood. Later that month, the trial date was set. It would be held in the county courthouse, and the state planned to bring in expert witnesses. The prosecutor asked if I'd be willing to speak to the media again, to help raise awareness about similar cases. I agreed. Not because I wanted attention, but because I'd learned something through all this. Silence lets people like Wanda grow roots. Cameras, documentation, and knowing your rights, those are the tools that cut through the noise. And sometimes, they're the only things that do. The courthouse was packed the day Wanda Shelton's trial began. Local papers had covered the grand jury indictment, but once the state pressed environmental charges, the story spread wider. A couple of independent journalists showed up from Raleigh, and someone from a regional podcast about community justice sat in the back row with a handheld recorder. I didn't come for the spectacle. I came because I needed to see it through. Walking into that courtroom, I didn't expect to feel anything. But the moment I saw her sitting at the defendant's table, surrounded by her lawyers, something stirred in me, not anger, not triumph. Just a cold, steady awareness of how far she'd been willing to go for control. That kind of person doesn't change. They just wait for the next opportunity. The prosecution opened with a quiet confidence. They didn't need theatrics. They had footage, chemical reports, witness statements, and a forensic analysis from the state's environmental lab that detailed how the glyphosate concentrate had enough potency to sterilize the subsurface soil for years. That report alone had stunned the judge during pre-trial hearings. When the prosecutor introduced me as the first witness, I stepped up and told the truth. Not just about what she did, but about how she used the HOA as a weapon. I described the pattern, how she cited residents for minor infractions, how she manipulated the bylaws to target those who challenged her, and how her self-appointed authority escalated into criminal behavior. I didn't embellish. I didn't need to. The facts were damning enough. Wanda's attorney tried to rattle me, asking why I didn't confront her the first time I suspected something. I told him I didn't want a confrontation, I wanted proof. That's what responsible people do when they're being harassed. They gather evidence. He shifted tactics, implying I'd exaggerated the damage for attention. But the lab results spoke louder than he ever could. They showed levels of toxicity that required decontamination protocol. This wasn't overwatering or bad compost. This was premeditated sabotage. When James Patel took the stand, he described how his lawn had turned bone white overnight, and how Wanda had accused him of violating color tone rules for grass. He hadn't even known such a rule existed because it didn't. The prosecution showed a map of the neighborhood marked with every homeowner who'd received fines from Wanda in the past year. The clustering was obvious. Every single one had either questioned her decisions at a board meeting or refused to comply with an arbitrary citation. The turning point came on the third day when the state's environmental agent, Claire Thomas, testified. She laid out the potential ecological damage. The chemical Wanda used was designed for industrial clear cutting, not residential yards. It had the potential to leach into the stormwater system, affecting wildlife habitats downstream. Her statement wasn't speculative. It came with charts, photos, and a sample analysis showing trace runoff had already begun. It hadn't reached dangerous thresholds, but if I hadn't replaced the soil, it might have. Her final remark hit hard. She said, "If Mr. Sanders hadn't installed that camera when he did, we would not be here today. And this neighborhood would still be at risk." Wanda's defense team looked shaken after that. Still, they tried to salvage something. They brought up her years of service, her commitment to neighborhood integrity, and her concern for community cohesion. The prosecutor countered with a single question: and how does pouring illegal chemicals into a neighbor's garden serve community cohesion? No answer. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the foreman read the verdict: guilty on all counts, felony criminal mischief, illegal possession and use of a restricted substance, trespassing, and environmental endangerment. The judge didn't wait for sentencing. He revoked her bail on the spot and set the sentencing hearing for the following week. I didn't stay for the press outside. I walked through the back lot, got into my truck, and drove home in silence. Hank met me at the door, tail wagging like nothing had changed. I sat on the step and watched the wind roll through the trees behind the houses. The neighborhood was quiet. At the sentencing hearing, the judge didn't hold back. Wanda was given 3 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after 18 months. She would also be required to pay full restitution to all affected homeowners, cover the state's environmental testing costs, and was permanently barred from serving on any HOA board in the state. Her name would be added to a regional registry of individuals prohibited from holding community governance positions. She never looked at me. After the sentencing, Janet officially stepped down from the board. She'd done what she could, but she said it was time for someone new to take over. The neighborhood voted in new leadership, including James Patel, who won by a landslide right in campaign. He didn't even ask to run people, just wrote his name down. The new board focused on transparency. They created a digital portal where all HOA activities were logged and accessible to every homeowner. Every fine required photographic evidence and a 3-member review. Rules were rewritten in plain language. No more vague clauses. No more aesthetic violations. If it wasn't spelled out, it couldn't be enforced. One Saturday in early April, our neighborhood held a volunteer planting day. Not a committee event, just people showing up with shovels, mulch, and seedlings. We replanted some of the green spaces Wanda had neglected, added benches to the walking path, and built a communal herb garden near the clubhouse. I brought extra tomato starters. A few folks who'd been wary of me before now asked for gardening tips. I didn't mind. We were starting fresh. That summer, my garden grew better than it ever had. The beans climbed to the top of the trellis, the squash bloomed like wildfire, and the tomatoes hung heavy and red. Hank took his job as garden guardian seriously, lounging nearby like he was guarding a national treasure. One evening, I was out watering when Melissa stopped by. She had a clipboard, but not the kind Wanda carried. Hers was filled with notes about a poll for future community projects. "We're thinking about a tool sharing shed," she said. "Some place to keep ladders, hedge trimmers, stuff people only use once a year," I nodded. "Smart." "Also," she added, "we started a neighborhood watch, not the paranoid kind, just a rotation of folks keeping an eye out. Thought maybe you'd be interested." I agreed. Not because I needed to keep watch anymore, but because it felt right to be part of something that was finally working the way it should. Before she left, she glanced at my garden and said, "Hard to believe something good came out of all that." "Sometimes," I said, "you've got to dig out the rot before anything can grow." She laughed quietly and walked off, clipboard in hand, disappearing down the sidewalk as the porch lights began to flicker on. I stood there for a while, hose in hand, watching the last light fade over the treetops. The air was calm. No threats in the mailbox, no strangers creeping through the yard. Just the rhythm of water hitting soil, the scent of basil on the breeze, and the quiet certainty that the fight was over. And we had won.